right, well, welcome back, everybody. We've got a lot to get through, so hopefully we can cover everything today. Last time, when we left on kind of a cliffhanger at the end of 2 Kings, where it seemed like everything was over. The Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, turned it to rubble, and all that's left now is, the peasants, and then a handful that survived and was exiled to Babylon. And this is a very large turning point in the history of the Jewish people, and a way to illustrate just how important this event is the Old Testament, the Bible you have in front of you, probably should never have been in front of you. The preservation of the Jewish religion is really miraculous, because at this point, the Israelites are discouraged. They feel like Yahweh's abandoned them. They thought, that no matter what, God might get mad, might give them a spanking every once in a while, but it was unimaginable that the temple, God's house, would be completely destroyed, that his people would be left to be slaughtered and exiled and be away from their land, their holy land. So this was really out of left field. Many, I'm sure, Israelites were discouraged. Thought maybe the Babylonians were the true gods, the gods that conquered and dominated them. And then you have just natural assimilation. So had Nebuchadnezzar and his successors have, continued to captivate the Israelites, it would only be a matter of a few generations before the memory of the laws of Moses, the memory of the temple would be vanished. They would no longer know Hebrew or the ways of their fathers. So for all intents and purposes, they were on the path of being extinct as a people and fully assimilated to Babylon over time. But God had other plans, right? What happened? Just as Jeremiah and Ezekiel prophesied, there would be a remnant that would go and return at one point, 70 years later, to restore and rebuild this second temple. And the accounts that we have is from Ezra-Nehemiah. So this accounts the miraculous journey of a restored Jerusalem, a restored temple, and a restored city, and a community, most importantly, a community faithful to Yahweh, which, would seem unimaginable. But God, through political and circumstances, turned things around to where the Jewish people would be restored. And so the story is recorded towards the end of our Bible chronologically. So this chapter of restoration is found in Ezra-Nehemiah. And just as your notes will tell you, this is kind of a misnomer, because originally Ezra-Nehemiah was one scroll. It wasn't until like a few hundred years after the time of Jesus that Christians divided into two books. But it was originally one scroll. And not only was this one scroll 2 accounts, it was 3 accounts. So there's a big misconception, if you go to your normal Sunday school and people raise their hands, summarize Ezra and Nehemiah. Oh, Ezra rebuilt the temple. Oh, Nehemiah rebuilt the walls. No, that's not quite right. Nehemiah did build the walls, but did Ezra rebuild the temple? No, he did not rebuild the temple. So the first story, the story of an unsung hero, Zerubbabel, a Davidic successor, is the first to return, and he and his high priest Jeshua and the returnees that come with him are actually the first wave that will go and restore the temple. Then about 50 years later, much later, Ezra will come to the scene and restore the Mosaic laws, the laws and ways of Moses back to the people. So that's what he's famous for. And then 12 years after Ezra comes to the scene, Nehemiah, who is a cupbearer of the Persian king, will come to the scene and rebuild the walls and becomes the governor of that province. So these are the 3 accounts that cover this time period. And I encourage you, if you have your notes, you can look at the bottom of, or the second half of your first page of the notes, it'll kind of go over the chronology of the three accounts, and then on the very bottom you can kind of see the Persian kings and the chronology there that overlaps with the events that we're about to talk about. So today we're going to go over Ezra's, or Zerubbabel, and then Ezra's story, and then next week when we meet again we'll go over Nehemiah's story. So starting with Ezra 1, the account of Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel's story is Ezra chapter 1 through 6, 50 years before the time of Ezra-Nehemiah. So, like we said, it seemed like Babylon was going to dominate. They were, settled with, the ways they built houses, they settled. They pretty much assimilated to Babylonian culture after the temple fell. But, about 50 years later, a little under 50 years later, a new king out of nowhere will kind of go and dominate the Babylonians themselves. So the Babylonians were seen as this, super invincible empire, but just like the Assyrians were seen as invincible, there's a coalition of Medes and a threat from the Far East, going towards the Persian Gulf and, a little before you get to Pakistan and India, you have this kingdom called Persia. They overtake the Babylonian city and will overtake and rule over what the Babylonians used to rule. And thankful for the Israelites, this is a very merciful king, gracious king, and what King Cyrus does, this Persian king, as a new regime, what he does is he really does a great political move to win the hearts of the captives of those who are under Babylon. He has a fiat to go and release and liberate those who, not only the Israelites, but all those who were under the thumb of Babylon, and that really helps win the loyalty and the hearts of the people. So King Cyrus will have this famous decree a year later, so he will talk about, so what year are we in? So he goes into, so he conquers, 539 he conquers, and in 538 he'll have this famous decree where he'll famously liberate the Jews, allow them to return to the land, and not only that, he is just really generous. He gives them all their holy objects, the vessels that Babylonian took with them, like the bronze altar, all the vessels and the pans and everything were all returned, is going to go back with them. So he has this decree, he helps fund it. Those who are staying, the other Israelites that are staying in Babylon, will help fund a journey back. And the natural leader for this project is a guy named Sheshbazzar. He's only mentioned really here at the end of chapter 1, but it might be another name for Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel, along with the tribal leaders and the Levitical priests, will go and take the treasures and go on a long, long journey back to Jerusalem. And just to give you an idea of how long it takes to get from Babylon all the way back to Jerusalem, who wants to guess how long that would take? Any guesses? Maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. It's a long road trip. 4 months. So it takes 4 months to travel all the way back from the Far East in Babylon all the way back to Jerusalem. And so after they make this long journey, they will rebuild the altar. They'll celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. And if you remember from Deuteronomy and Exodus, that it's a remembrance of Moses and the Israelites' time in the wilderness. So they really have no choice, right? So if you remember, this place is destroyed. So think about, the Twin Towers after 9/11, except it's the whole city of New York, and that's what Jerusalem is. It's nothing but rubble and wasteland. And so that's what they return to, and, what more appropriate way to celebrate than booths, right? Living in tents, because they have no choice. So they're very symbolically back in the wilderness again at this point of time. So if you look at chapter 2, that's more of just an extensive list of all those who returned with Zerubbabel in the first wave. 42,000 come back along with their servants. And then they begin rebuilding. So if you remember from 1 Kings, what did Solomon do when he built his first temple? He was friends with the king of Tyre, and he helped, get his Phoenician workmen to import the wood, the cedars of Lebanon, and the same thing is repeating itself. So they're importing wood to hire craftsmen back. They have Levitical priests who will oversee the temple construction. And in the second year, they finally lay down the foundations of the temple. So it's getting exciting. There's celebration. There's singing. That this temple is at least now beginning to finally rebuild after it was never foreseen that this day would come. And so not long after the foundations are built, these local Samaritans, if you remember, these are the people who, when the northern kingdom fell, the Assyrians will import all of these Mesopotamian tribes and these mixed groups to go and kind of intermix with the northern kingdom, and it led to this amalgam of different people with different beliefs, with all kind of beliefs, none that were loyal to Yahweh. So these local people wants to kind of say, hey, can we rebuild, help you, Zerubbabel? Looks like you can use a hand, we can help rebuild the temple and restore it. And Zerubbabel doesn't want these people to help. He doesn't want them to feel invested because they're not, pure Israelites. They're not pure Yahweh worshipers. So he knows that that's going to get messy if they get involved. So he's like, no. Cyrus gave us authority. Here's the paperwork. We're the only ones authorized to build the temple as we like it. And obviously they don't take too well to this. So the Samaritans will kind of go behind their back and spread all these bad rumors about the Israelites, the returnees that have come, and say, how awful they are, and how they really want to reestablish David back to the throne and want to overthrow the Persian government and are the seditionists and whatnot. And we actually have a letter. If you look at chapter 4, verses 6 through 22, there's a real-life correspondence. This is an actual letter that was preserved in its full Aramaic. It's not written in Hebrew. And it's a letter between these Persian officials and King Artaxerxes. The interesting about this is that this is a future letter. So Artaxerxes is actually the king during the time of Ezra-Nehemiah, which is 50 years in the future. So we can maybe speculate that this letter was inserted in Zerubbabel's account because maybe this was the only preserved letter that kind of is an example of what this was like. These Persian governors spreading, local people spreading bad rumors about the Israelites and the Persians responding in kind. But Artaxerxes is not the person who halted it. It would either have to be King Cyrus or his successor, who is King Cambyses. So one of those, but in either way, either Cyrus or Cambyses more likely halted the construction, and the returnees are just so discouraged. They made this big 4 months journey, and it was all for naught. They're not going to be able to rebuild the temple. But out of nowhere, we have these two big figures, prophets named Haggai and Zechariah. And if you look towards the end of your Old Testament, those books might be familiar to you. So you can read, their actual accounts if you go to their books. But anyways, in the story, they prophesize that no, the people are meant to rebuild, go and rebuild. And the community gets this, this injection of adrenaline to, yes, let's go. And their morale is raised, and they ignore the Persian, having their authority revoked and rebuild anyways. So they continue to rebuild, and as they're rebuilding, the governor over Judah, who is Persian, named Tatenai, he asks their attorney, he's like, hey, what are you guys doing? Where's your paperwork? Where's your authority to do this? And they say, well, look, we have, there's a decree that Cyrus has. We promise it's there. Go ask the new king. So there's a new king at this moment called King Darius, who succeeds Cambyses. And he's like, get Darius to go look at the archives, and you'll definitely see that King Cyrus gave us the authority to do this. So, the governor is like, okay. And we, again, have a real correspondence with the governor to Darius, requesting, saying that these, Israelites are saying one thing and wants to verify if it's true. And so in chapter 6, King Darius looks, and in his summer palace he finds the original decree, and then we get a second correspondence in Aramaic with Darius responding to the governor, and he gives, not only the Jews get what they asked for, they get so much more. So Darius is really benevolent to these returnees, and he gives them the following commands. So in the letter he says, the governor, Tessanai, don't even, you get a restraining order. Don't even go near him. Don't harass him. Don't bother him. Just get away from there. So they're, to be undisturbed. Additionally, they're going to actually pay from their revenue to ensure the temple is complete, and it's going to help cover the cost of the animals and the grains and the sacrificial offerings. So this is really ironic. So the people who always wanted to stop the Israelites from rebuilding, they're going to get higher taxes to rebuild the temple now. So that's really ironic. So Darius is imposing more taxes to ensure the temple is restored, and anyone who disobeys this decree, it's an interesting little punishment. So they're going to get their house confiscated. In addition to getting their house confiscated, the beams of their house, they're going to get impaled upon it. So he means serious business. So this new king, Darius, is just really benevolent to the Israelites and really rallies to their cause. And so with this really generous backing, the temple is finally complete during the 6th year of Darius' reign in 516 BC, exactly 70 years after the temple was fallen. So Jeremiah's prophecy comes to a T, 70 years right after the destruction. And so the Jewish community celebrate, they reinstate the Levitical priesthood, they host this mass dedication, if you remember, in 1 Kings, where there's this big celebration with Solomon. We get kind of a reenactment of this, the Passover feast, and then you have 7 days of the unleavened bread celebrated. So this also just symbolizes that the Mosaic law is back and is kicking, and we got our temple now, so now we can finally get back to the laws of Moses. And that is how Zerubbabel's story will end. And so it ends on a really high note that things are coming back to normal. And so the distance between Ezra chapter 6 and chapter 7 is 50 years. So 50 years later, we're going to get another story of what happens in the next generation. And in between those 50 years, it's interesting to point out that the king in between Darius and Artaxerxes is a guy named Ahasuerus, which I just like pronouncing his Greek name Xerxes. So Xerxes is going to be familiar to you if you've ever read the book of Esther. So if you've read the book of Esther, we're not going to go way into it, but chronologically that's where the story takes place. And for those who don't know about it, it's basically a story of this beautiful Jewish orphan living in Babylon who wins this beauty contest to be Xerxes' next wife, and she uses her position to basically save the Jews, makes a really riskful plea to Xerxes to stop this prescription or this direction to kill the Jews, and puts it to an end. So you can learn more about that if you read the book of Esther, but other than being a triumphant story, it's also an interesting book because it gives you a story and an insight of life outside of, how Jews still thrived and lived in Babylon and came to very high places and positions in life. So they did very well for themselves. So Esther has an uncle that takes care of her named Mordecai. He is like a high Persian official. Also Nehemiah himself, he's a cupbearer, another very high court official in the Persian court. So Israelites did just fine, even those who didn't return. So they continue to thrive in Babylon and in Persia and Susa and all that region. So next we're going to get into the story of Ezra. That's going to be our next account. So we're going to finish off Ezra 1 through 10, and then Nehemiah 8 through 10, even though it technically takes place during the time of Nehemiah, it's still Ezra's story. So we're going to get better closure if we go ahead and also bring in Nehemiah 8 to 10, because chapter 10 of Ezra really ends abruptly. So Ezra, 50 years later has passed. There's a new king called Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is another person who's really benevolent to the Jews and looking out for their cause. So he goes and commissions this expert of the law who's also, like Jeshua, a descendant of Aaron. So he has a really good pedigree, and he is an expert scribe, and he is sent by Artaxerxes to go return along with any Jews who want to return with him, and they'll make up the second wave who comes to Jerusalem 50 years later. One thing I'll say about Ezra, what he is most famous for is without him and his leadership and the Levitical priests around him, you, again, probably would not have the Bible you have in front of you the way you have it. So it was probably under Ezra and his successors that the Bible was canonized. Unlike the New Testament, we have a lot of documentation of how the canonization happened in the New Testament. We have none for the Old Testament, but in rabbinic tradition, Ezra is seen as like the second Moses, the second lawgiver who has an expert in modernizing the Hebrew, modernizing in the sense of Aramaic, the Assyrian way of Hebrew that we use to this day. And he also is credited with maybe putting the canon together, more or less the way that we know it today to be. So, in long story short, Ezra is a big deal. Okay, so Ezra is a great figure in Jewish history. And if you want to see the actual commissioning letter, again, which is in Aramaic, you can find it in chapter 7, verses 12 through 26. And the letter from Artaxerxes makes the following requirement of him. He is to go to Jerusalem, regulate Judah in accordance to the laws of Moses, and he's going to basically have the purview of having the religious laws be enforced for the first wave, the first generation that came under Zerubbabel. He also has a huge, generous donation that Artaxerxes is going to give him from the royal treasury or the Persian treasury. That's going to help maintain the sacrifices, the wood, all the supplies that go into the Jewish rituals. He is going to give a really nice offering for that. And he's also going to be assigned to appoint local magistrates and judges who will rule according to both Mosaic and the imperial or the Persian law that, kind of like the federal law that everyone has to abide by. So he goes, and in chapter 8, he have this huge list, another big genealogy list of a census of all the people that joined Ezra and the second wave, the second generation that goes with him. And they all rally to the Ava River, which is a river we don't really know where it is, but this river in Babylon that they're all going to kind of rally to. And an interesting fact that mentions it, so when Ezra is having his correspondence with Artaxerxes, apparently he's so confident and say, I don't need any, Artaxerxes offers him like this royal escort to make sure they're protected and no bandits are going to come and get their treasures. And so remember, this is a long 4-month journey. And Ezra's like, no, our God's going to protect us, don't worry about it. And so, as he started his journey, he's like, okay, I really need to get serious. So he fasts, he prays, he's like, okay, God, really don't let us down. So he prays and fasts before, and 4 months later, he arrives safely into Jerusalem, where the second wave will encamp for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, they'll kind of take an inventory, make sure all the treasure's there, everything checks out, and he hands over the letter, to signal that he has the authority to do what he's doing. And so not long after that, we get through our first kind of crisis with the new community here. And upon arriving, he learns that the Jews from the first wave, they began intermarrying with the people of the land. So the people of the land is a catch-all term. It includes Samaritans. It includes just basically everyone that's not a Yahwehist, not everyone that's completely loyal to Yahweh. So they're intermarrying with these different groups, and it's compromising, just like the ancient Israelites, it's compromising both their conduct and their genealogy. So that's a problem. Ezra responds by tearing his clothes, tearing his hair, tearing his beard out, and just sits in desolation. And later that evening, he just, goes and confesses in the middle of the temple about, being on his knees, repenting. And as he's doing this, there's this crowd that kind of oversees and hears what Ezra's doing and begins like weeping alongside of him, kind of encircling him. And they begin, praying as well. And then, out of nowhere, this Levite, Shechaniah, he will say, he'll be, rally people for a call in action, saying, "Oh, we need to expel, not only these women, these pagan women, but their children, their illegitimate children as well." And just as Ezra is finished, he places the crowd and the community around him under this oath to only be loyal to the laws of Moses. And he continues to fast inside the temple. And after fasting, he comes with an epiphany. He goes and proclaims to all Jerusalem and all Judah that there is going to be this mandatory, very serious meeting that's going to take place in 3 days. And if you don't come in this 3 days, you're getting kicked out. You're kicked out of the community if you don't come to this meeting. So 3 days have passed, and they have this meeting on the 12th day of the 9th month. And he has this mandatory meeting to repent and an expulsion for all the foreign women in Jerusalem. So the community agrees, but the community is also like, well, there's a problem, like this is really out of hand, like this is what everyone's doing, and we can't just, expel everyone overnight. We're going to need to have like a large-scale investigation. So they agree to make this really big investigation that takes place over 2 months. These Levitical officers named Jonathan and Josiah will recruit and investigate and make sure and form a list of all the people who have intermarried and all the violators. And you can find their list in chapter 10, verses 18 through 43. At the very end of Ezra is this long list of people who are caught intermarrying. One notable person on there is, these high-ranking officials. So Jeshua, the person that came 50 years earlier to be the high priest, even he is guilty of intermarrying over time. So, a lot of corrosion that's happened since the time of Zerubbabel, and Ezra is there to reform it. And so now we're going to fast forward. His story isn't going to end here. We're going to fast forward to Nehemiah chapter 8. In Nehemiah chapter 8, 12 years later, after Nehemiah comes to the scene, after the walls are built, during a New Year's festival of Rosh Hashanah, the Jews are going to gather. Ezra is going to be at the entrance, the eastern entrance of Jerusalem on a wooden tower, and for the first time he's going to publicly teach in Hebrew the laws of Moses, the scroll that Josiah found, the book of Deuteronomy. And the people will just prostrate themselves, hearing this, and remember that, this new generation can't even remember what Hebrew is. They've never set foot in Jerusalem. They've never seen, experienced a temple before they came onto the scene. And so he has these Levitical people, priests, to go and actually translate what's being said and commentate on what's being understood. And so the crowd understands, they react in sadness. And Ezra and Nehemiah kind of funnily, they say, no, you have to be happy. You are mandated to be happy. This is a celebration. You're hearing the law. Be happy. Turn that frown upside down. So they're mandated to be glad and be thankful for hearing the law and not sad. And so, the next day, Ezra looks at the scroll and learns about the Sakath, so booths. You remember in Zerubbabel, that's the first thing they celebrate. They really didn't have a choice because they had to live in tents. But, at this point, everything's resettled. They have houses. But they say, hey, don't live in your houses for 7 days. You got to go to the mountains, get these palm branches, build little tents on top of your house roof and in your courtyards, and live there for 7 days and celebrate for the remembrance of the time of the wilderness. So they do that. They go and gather all these palm branches and will celebrate for 7 days. And then, so not long after that is, if you remember from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you have what? You have Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. And so about 2 weeks after the Day of Atonement, the community once again gathers and fasts and hears the public reading of the scroll. And we'll have just a big time of confession. And so this is just a really big section of all the Levitical leaders confessing on behalf of the people. So most of Nehemiah chapter 9 is all about what they're confessing. It starts in verse 6, ends in verse 37. And to summarize it, they just, start by praising God, and then they allude to, Israel's history, starting from Abraham all the way into Judges and Kings. And the interesting thing about this is when the people retell the stories of what happened in the Old Testament, they retell it in a new way. So it's not exactly the way understood as it was in Exodus, even though they cite it. They re-understand it in the wake of their new community. So in their perspective, they're seeing themselves as a second Exodus. The first one came from Egypt. This one is coming from Babylon to return to God's promised land. But at the end of the prayer, there's a little, unlike the first Exodus where, they leave Egypt, they conquer and dominate their new promised land. What happens this time? Do they dominate? No. They're still under the shackle of Pharaoh. So they're not a independent nation. They're still, they have a merciful overseer, but they're nevertheless a vassal still of Persia. So after this confession, the Levites will create and enforce this written oath, fully restoring the Mosaic covenant, and will make the following requirements for this community. So there's a prohibition on marrying outside the community. We're not going to have that crisis again. There's going to be no purchasing at the city gate from foreign merchants on the Sabbath day, so that's going to be kept holy. The Sabbath day is going to be enforced. And then they are to observe Jubilee. In the 7th year, every 7 years, they'll nullify all debt. If you need a refresher on that, feel free to go back, or any of these laws, you can go back to our previous roadmap video covering all of Deuteronomy and the laws. And it'll also be in Deuteronomy chapter 15 if you want to know about Jubilee. So in addition to that, the clans are to rotate. They're casting lots and rotating, who's going to be responsible for getting the wood for the sacrifices, so they got that obligation. They have to tithe. In addition to Persian taxes, they also have to be taxed or tithe 1/3 of a shekel every year in order to keep the temple maintained and activities going. They're also, in addition to that 1/3 shekel, they're also going to donate, just what Deuteronomy tells you to do. Donate your firstborn beast or son to the temple, your first wine, your first dough, your first grain, all of that's going to be stored in the storehouse of the temple. And so this is where Ezra's stories ends with the restoration of the pre-exilic laws of Moses being reinstated, fully restored for this new generation of Jews who, for all intents and purposes, have forgotten about the ways of God. So next time when we meet again, we're going to go over the final account of this trilogy covering the restoration of Israel in the Second Temple, and that will be the story of Nehemiah, who is a cupbearer in Artaxerxes' court, who will come 12 years later after feeling burdened to come rebuild the walls, and we'll also hear about how he governed, and we'll learn more about that next time. So hope to see you then. For those who has not been familiar with the story of Esther?
I'm somewhat, because of the Jews actually every year, the bad guy is
The
dressed like
Purim
a clown.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really
they read the story.
yeah. There's they reenact it, and it's a very comedic story. So basically, what happens is that you have a situation where Xerxes, we hear Xerxes, the king that's in between Zerubbabel's generation and Ezra-Nehemiah's generation. He is drunk. He has he's had too much booze, and asked his wife, I forgot her name, so it starts with a V. Vashti. Yeah, Vashti. To come, assumingly naked, to be paraded at this party with nothing but this diamond necklace he gave her as a gift. And of course, she doesn't want to humiliate herself. And so, what do fair-minded, reasonable kings do? They kick her out, exile her, and get a new bride by a beauty contest. So that's what he does. He has this big beauty contest. Gets all this harem of these beautiful virgins in this contest. And one of the contestants is a Jew who's an orphan, watched over by her uncle who is in the Persian court named Mordecai. And Esther will, win this contest and just is really pleased by Xerxes. And then there's another subplot within this plot where Mordecai, her uncle, and a guy named Haman, who is also part of the court of Persia. So Persia has all these different court people from all their vassals that they've taken over. So, Mordecai is from Judah, and then you have Haman, who is from like a rival of Judah, which was, I think, either I think it's like the Amalekites or the Ammon, or one of the local tribes that were rivals of Jerusalem back in the time. So they're both, vassals of Persia. They come to Persia. They're in the court. They don't like each other. And Haman is like the favored one. So he's like second in command, really high up. And because Mordecai refuses to bow to him, he only bows to, God. He just says, I'm insulted. How dare you, peasant, not bow to me. And so what he does is he gets a plot. He basically, and Xerxes is really easily manipulated. So he basically convinces the Persians to have what's called a prescription. Do you guys know what the prescription means? It's it's a term by the Romans. When Octavian wanted to kill his rivals to seize power, along with Mark Antony, they made a hit list of all the people he wanted killed. And so Haman does a similar thing where he does a hit list of all the Jewish people to get back at Mordecai. So he's favored. He's like, oh my goodness, the king is going to, basically, exalt me, and I'm going to, be second in command. And Mordecai, meanwhile, he saves, there's like a side story where Mordecai saves Xerxes from assassination. And after a while, he gets this decree that it's a reminder that who saved me from that assassination plot? Oh, it's Mordecai. And so he goes to Haman, and he's like, Haman, there's this great gentleman who did this great favor for me. What should I do? And Haman thinks it's himself. And so Haman is like, oh, you need to put him on your horse, your chariot. You need to wave him, parade him like a king, and do all this and that. And he's like, okay, we'll do this to Mordecai, who you're trying to kill. And so he has to submit and get Mordecai this place of honor. It's really ironic. And then Esther, so Esther hears about this prescription, and he goes to Mordecai, and Mordecai is like, you know what, get the courage and go to Xerxes and, ask him. But remember, this is not, queen and king is not like a equal power dynamic. He's basically like a trophy wife. And if she gets out of line, she can be killed. So, to get an audience with the king, you need to get you have to have 6 month tickets in advance. You can't just do an improv appointment to the king. So she has to break that protocol, and it can risk her life, because if he doesn't raise a scepter, that's kind of the cue to kill her, to not bother the dear leader. So she comes, and out of nowhere goes to him. She raises the scepter and allowed to plead with her, and Xerxes is once again really easily manipulated. Like, oh, of course, we'll call off this whole we won't kill your people, but oh my goodness, I read it, I wrote it out, it has to come to pass. No, wait, I'm retelling it wrong. Okay, so so scratch that. So she goes to the king and just asks for a banquet. So they just ask for a banquet, and invites Mordecai to this banquet. And during the second banquet that they convene, she says to the king, like, oh, there's this awful person, again unnamed, this person who wants to kill my own people, and no one knows that Esther is a Jew. So that's another meaningful thing to the plot. And so Esther is like, they're wiping out my own people, and wants to eradicate us. And Xerxes is like, oh my goodness, like who dares wants to destroy all of the queen's people. And she like stands up and points at Haman, this wretched man Haman, and Haman's like, oh no, like this isn't good. No one knew that she was a Jew, so he thought he was just getting back at Mordecai, but little did he know that Esther was his niece. And so you get this really funny scene where the king is just raged. He storms out. He storms out just like that bottle, and storms out the room. And then while he's storming out the room, he's just like on the couch, just like pleading with the king. And after getting some of the steam off, the king comes back, and like he's pleading in a really compromising position. And so Xerxes comes to the room. He's like, "What? Are you here to ravish my queen too?" And so you get this scene where he's in real big trouble now. So not only is Esther mad at him, but the king is like thinking that he's after his woman. And so the gallows, this noose that was reserved, this 50-foot noose that was reserved to kill Mordecai during the extinction of the Jews, is now going to be used by Haman, ironically. And so it's really comical. There's like irony all around. Like Haman thinks he's like on this high level, and again, like the table's always turned against him. Like everything he wants to do like goes back to him. And so at the end, the decree still has to go out, because once the Persian king makes a decree, like it can't be erased. Like there's no undo button. It has to go out. And so on that day, he has another decree on top of that the Jews are able to defend themselves. So after that decree goes out, there's a heroic triumph where there's this battle where the Jews in Babylon defend themselves and slaughter a lot of the Babylonians or whoever's trying to get after them. And there's this big victory. And after this, to celebrate this monumentous moment, they have a new holiday called Purim. And what Purim is lots. So if you remember Haman, who made it, he casted lots to find out the date of when the Jews would be killed. And so that ironically became the name. His lots will be the title of the holiday, celebrating the casting of Haman's lots, where the Jews overcame those who opposed them or tried to kill them. And that's the story of Esther, from what I can remember off the top of my head.